All right, let's talk about a war that completely reshaped our world. It's an incredible story, really, about how an empire's single greatest victory actually paved the way for its most humiliating defeat. We've got legendary generals, the birth of a global superpower, and the totally unexpected spark of a revolution. Let's get right into it.
So, if I ask you, what was the First World War? What pops into your head? Probably 1914, right? Most people would say that. But what if I told you the first truly global conflict, one fought on pretty much every continent, happened a full 150 years earlier? It was called the 7 Years' War. And by the end of this, you'll see exactly why it deserves the title of the real First World War. Now, what makes this war so fascinating is that you can almost think of it as two completely different wars happening at the exact same time. On one side, you have this desperate, bloody struggle for survival right in the heart of Europe. And on the other, you have this massive, high-stakes chess match between empires for control of the entire globe. These two stories were happening in parallel, and the way they finally crashed into each other, well, that changed everything.
So, let's start in Europe, with a story that honestly became the stuff of military legend. At the very center of it all was this small but super ambitious kingdom called Prussia, and its brilliant, if a little complicated, king, Frederick the Great.
Okay, just look at these numbers for a second. It's kind of hard to believe. You've got tiny Prussia with a population of less than 5 million people going up against a coalition of the three biggest heavyweights on the continent: Austria, France, and Russia. I mean, together, they had almost 20 times the population and an army nearly 3 times the size. This was David versus Goliath, no question about it.
And this quote from Frederick himself just says it all, doesn't it? He was completely surrounded, with enemies pouring in from every direction. For years, he was literally racing his army from one border to the next, just trying to plug one hole in the dam before another one burst open. It was this constant, frantic fight to just survive.
But then, the miracle happened. Against all of those impossible odds, Frederick didn't just survive, he started winning. In late 1757, in the span of just 1 month, he completely crushed a French army at Rossbach, and then, just weeks later, pulled off a tactical masterpiece against the Austrians at Leuthen. These weren't just wins, they were like military earthquakes that sent shockwaves across Europe and cemented his legacy as one of the greatest commanders in history.
Okay, but while Frederick is fighting for his kingdom's very existence in Germany, that second war, the much bigger war, was absolutely raging across the rest of the planet. For Great Britain and France, this wasn't about some little piece of land in Europe. No, this was for all the marbles. This was for global domination.
And when we say global, we really, really mean it. In North America, they called it the French and Indian War. In India, huge battles were deciding the fate of the entire subcontinent. Fleets were clashing over these incredibly valuable sugar islands in the Caribbean. The fighting even went all the way to the Philippines. This was a war on a scale the world had never, ever seen before.
And right there, at the very beginning of it all, we find a name you might recognize. A young, ambitious colonial officer from Virginia named George Washington. Yep, his early skirmishes out in the Ohio Valley helped light the fuse of this global powder keg, kicking off a chain of events that would, pretty ironically, lead to the creation of his very own country.
Now, jump halfway across the world, and the stakes were just as massive. In the very same year as Frederick's miracle victories, a British commander named Robert Clive won a stunningly decisive battle at a place called Plassey. This one single fight basically shattered French power in India and laid the groundwork for the next 200 years of the British Raj.
So, here's the crucial point. This is how the two stories connect. While Frederick was busy tying up the massive French army in Europe, Britain was pouring money into his war effort. They were essentially paying him to keep their biggest rival distracted, which freed them up to go conquer the rest of the world. And you know what? The strategy worked. Maybe a little too well.
The final result looked like an absolute, total triumph. The 1763 Treaty of Paris was a complete humiliation for France. They got kicked out of Canada, and their influence in India was basically gone. Britain, on the other hand, was now the undisputed global superpower. They had an empire on which the sun, quite literally, would never set. But every victory has a price tag.
And what a price tag it was. 133 million pounds. Now, that might not sound like a world-ending number to us, but in the 18th century, that was an astronomical, terrifying amount of money. The national debt had doubled. The war had basically bankrupted the winners. The British government was staring down the barrel of a financial catastrophe. So this gigantic mountain of debt meant London had to find cash, and they had to find it fast. They looked across the Atlantic Ocean to their American colonies that had, benefited a lot from getting rid of the French threat, and they thought, well, it's about time they paid their fair share. This turned out to be a fateful and ultimately fatal mistake.
You can literally watch the dominoes fall one by one. The war created the debt. The debt forced Parliament to create new taxes like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, specifically for the American colonists. The colonists, who had 0 representatives in that Parliament, absolutely exploded, with the famous cry, "No taxation without representation." And that cry? That became the rallying cry for the American Revolution. The world's greatest empire, at the absolute peak of its power, had just planted the seeds of its own undoing.
So we're left with this incredible irony. The very war that made Britain a global superpower is also the war that led directly to them losing their prized American colonies. It makes you wonder, right? Can an empire's greatest victory also be the beginning of its downfall? Well, the story of the real First World War seems to prove that yes, it absolutely can. Thanks for joining me.